Well, let's jump in to our time in Samuel. So let me start by saying this. If you remember this little review, we said that in Samuel, the second major theme in Samuel was the God who does what? You're welcome to look at your notes. Okay, the God who brings low and the God who exalts. Okay? Now, what we just finished seeing is we fast-forwarded from the theme. If you were to follow that theme through the book, you would see at almost every section God is exalting someone and He's bringing someone low. In the section that we're focused on, we were focused on Israel demanding a king. And so we were introduced to Israel's first king, who was King Saul. And what we just ended class on was when Yahweh rejected Saul. So in other words, Yahweh is judging him, bringing him down. So usually in Samuel, there's kind of a crossover of characters. So when God is bringing someone down, He is in the process of exalting someone else. Does that make sense? So you see this at the beginning of the book with Eli and his wicked sons and the prophet Samuel. God's judging Eli's house, and Samuel is rising as a prominent leader in Israel. And what we're seeing the same thing with Saul and David. So we're about to get into David's life today. And in the book of Samuel, David is an interesting character. Have you guys ever seen or read or heard of the phrase Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? You know, it's based off a novel where you have this doctor, Dr. Jekyll, who has this potion that when he takes it, he becomes Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde is a pretty sinister and wicked guy, right? And so you get the same person who has two different personas, so to speak. Well, as you're going to see today, as we're going to see in Samuel, there is two Davids we're going to meet today. There's the great, good David, and there's also the David who failed big time. And many of you know where I'm going with that and how that story ran. So let's pick up where we left off last class with Yahweh's rejection of Saul. So Saul made two monster sins. He committed two monster sins that in both times the prophet Samuel comes and tells him, God's going to reject you. The second time happens in 1 Samuel 15, right? And what's interesting is in 1 Samuel 16 is when we begin to really get the first clues that this David is coming. We actually get it in Samuel's words to Saul. But then in 1 Samuel 17, we get everybody's favorite story about David, and that is David and Goliath, right? And so oftentimes we snatch David and Goliath out of context and go straight to our day and age instead of thinking of its role in the story. Its role in the story is again, God had just rejected Saul as king and said He was going to raise up another king. And we're introduced to David as basically this warrior kid, really. I mean, he would have been a young man. He would have been probably a teenager or a little older. But he comes to the battle, right, after shepherding his flock. And all of Israel is in a panic because they are scared of this giant Goliath. And yet David walks out there, but he doesn't do it in his own strength. He clearly does it in the name of the Lord. In other words, what David is concerned about is Yahweh's reputation. And so he's basically out there defending his God to this giant. And because of that, God gives him victory in the battle. And David, in essence, becomes a military hero because of that. So what happens is, as David shows his faith and his trust in Yahweh, which remember this lines up with what we know about David. What is David called in the Bible? A man after God's own heart. So one of the things that's emphasized throughout 1 Samuel, the second half, is David's character. And so what happens is David begins to gain some popularity. And in fact, in 1 Samuel 18, it tells us about a time where they were coming back from battle, and David was coming in, and the women basically are lined up on the street, actually all the people, and they said Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. And at that point in the story, we start seeing that the green monster of envy jumps Saul. And he literally turns into a different person for the rest of the story. So the rest of 1 Samuel, as we were watching David go up and Saul go down, is all about how much Saul hated David. In fact, in chapter 18, after that little story of basically David coming in and getting the victory parade after the people cheered, it says Saul became David's enemy continually. Okay, that's in chapter 18. Then 3 times in the same chapter, it tells us that Saul was afraid of David. So you see what happens? You guys know how it works. When you're jealous or envious of another person, what happens? It quickly turns not just to I'm jealous of them, but I don't like them and I actually hate them, right? It's a quick street, and that's exactly what we see with Saul and David. In fact, Saul tried to kill David 3 times. Okay? Now here's the deal. If you want to live on the edge, if you're an adrenaline junkie and you want a good adrenaline rush, but you don't want to die, then just let Saul throw a spear at you. Okay? Because he obviously was not a master spearsman because he missed every time he threw his spear. He tried to kill David 2 times with a spear. Another time he tried to kill him with this weird story about going down to the Philistines and getting the foreskin of the Philistines. You can read all about it in Samuel. I'm not making this stuff up. But he failed that one too. Now here's the deal. He hated David so much that he even tried to kill his own son Jonathan with a spear. And again, he missed, by the way, right? But anyway, he even tried to kill his own son Jonathan because why? Jonathan recognized that God was with David and that God was exalting David. And so he was even mad at his son for basically protecting David from him. So what happens is there's 2 occasions where actually the character of Saul and the character of David are highlighted. And so there's 2 times in the story in 1 Samuel at the end of the book where David could have killed Saul, could have easily killed him. One time, David was at a place in the desert down by the Dead Sea called En-Gedi, which was this desert oasis, and he was hiding in a cave, and Saul came in to use the restroom. And David was literally right behind him, and does everybody remember what happened here? All David's men were saying, basically get him, and David wouldn't. In fact, David cut off the edge of his robe, and then basically when Saul leaves, David comes out and announces what he had done, and basically let him know, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Another time they were asleep, and David snuck down to camp and could have killed him. His soldiers told him to kill him, but he didn't. But here's what's important to see. Here you have a king, Saul, who is chasing one of his leading generals, his most successful general, around the desert, trying to kill him, simply not because David did anything wrong. In fact, Saul tells him, you're righteous. And Saul even admitted he knew God was with David. But you have this king who's chasing around this guy who's done nothing but be loyal to him to try to kill him simply because he was more successful than the king. And yet you have David who is being chased around, right? I mean, think about if you had somebody who hated you so much, they chased you around and tried to kill you. Chances are, if you had them in a corner and you could kill them, you would probably do what? Just go ahead and take them out, right? Solve all your problems. David had that chance twice. But does anybody remember why David said he would not kill Saul? He said he would not stretch his hand out against the Lord's anointing. Here's what David saw. David saw past the character flaws to Saul's position. Now, I would encourage us as American Christians this is a good application for how we speak about and how we talk about politicians. Because they're all crooked. I mean, I was going to tell you. But we still should honor them not because of their character, but because of their position, right? And that's exactly what David does. David could have killed him, should have killed him. Any of us probably would have killed him, but David says, I'm not doing it because God is appointing him as king. And if God wants him out, what? God's going to take him out, not me. Okay? So David really does show his integrity in this story. All right? So that's Saul. Saul dies at the last chapter of 1 Samuel. And then 2 Samuel kind of turns our attention to really David's exaltation. There was a period, so we're going to talk about David's reign. Now what happens initially is David doesn't instantly become king over all 12 tribes. Okay? What happens instantly is actually the kingdom is kind of divided. And many of the people are basically loyal to one of Saul's sons. His name is Ishbosheth. And so then David is just ruling over one tribe. And you already know what that tribe is. That tribe is Judah. So he reigns for 7.5 years over Judah in a little town called Hebron. Okay, he reigns for 7.5 years in Hebron. Then eventually, again, crossovers in the book, it says there's a verse that says in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "And David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul became weaker and weaker." So eventually what happens after 7 years is the rest of the tribes come to David and ask him to be their king. And so then David reigns over all of Israel in Jerusalem for 33 years. And by the way, David is the one who actually first conquers Jerusalem. It was a Canaanite stronghold that basically the Israelites didn't capture in the time of Joshua. But David captures it, and that's where he establishes his capital in Jerusalem, okay? So David reigns for 40 years. Now, there's several things we could talk about. David, again, was great and had great military success. He was a great warrior. But what I want us to focus on is a really important transition in the biblical story, and one that you guys read about in Von Roberts. And this is really a really important covenant, and it's called the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now here's what I'm going to do. I actually want you guys to do a small group on this one. So just group up at your tables to talk about it. I might give you 2 questions to answer. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to read 2 Samuel 7, 8 through 17. Okay, so what? 10 verses there. And then I want you to answer, what are the key promises in this passage? Let me give you a hint. Also know who the promises are given to in the passage. And then I want you to answer, how do these promises relate back to the Abrahamic covenant? Everybody good on that one? So what are the key promises, and how do these promises relate back to the Abrahamic? Go ahead, discuss it for a few minutes, and we're through. We'll discuss it as a class. What are the key promises that you saw? Let's talk about this. This thing was loaded with promises. Yeah. So he's going to give them a place, and what's significant about the place? What else is accompanying the place?
It will be safe.
Yeah, safe, secure, right? They're not going to be met. Their enemies aren't going to mess with them anymore. Good. Does anybody want to give us another one? Offspring. Okay, this one's important though. So I'm going to come back to that one. So at the end, he says, I'm going to give you basically a son, an offspring after you, right? Who's going to come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And then we're going to talk about the rest of the part. Are there any other promises that you saw? So this is Nathan. I guess I should set up the context. This is Nathan the prophet speaking to David. And we're about to talk about why he's speaking to him. But yeah, so he's going to make David's name great. So he's going to make David's name great, give Israel a place, a safe place, and give David an offspring. Yes, the offspring's kingdom will be established forever. Yes, God's going to be with him, which God with you is code word for blessing. Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about this final part. Let's talk about this final part here. When he's talking about the offspring, he said he's going to give him an eternal kingdom, but what kind of metaphor does he use that we talked about on Wednesday? He says he's going to build him a house. Now, you got to understand the context. This passage begins with David asking God if he could build God a house. And David is talking about a temple, right? Because David's saying, God's been dwelling in this tent. I'm going to build him a house. And Nathan says, you're not going to build God a house, but actually God's going to give you an offspring. And if you want to look with me, it's in verse 13. He says, in verse 13, verse 12, your offspring is going to come. I'm going to establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So what house are they talking about here? Is he talking about what house is God? The son's going to build what kind of house? The temple. Okay, and then it goes on to say, I'm going to be to him a father. He's going to build to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I'm going to discipline him with the rods of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And then in verse 16, here's the key. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your thrones shall be established forever. So in that last reference, what is house referring to? What's that now? Yes, his reign. So in other words, there's a play on house in this. David wants to build a temple. God says, your son's going to build a temple, but I'm going to establish your dynasty forever. This is where we got that first theme, right? This passage is ultimately filled in Jesus, but there actually is some tension there if we take it straight to Jesus. And what's that tension?
Like the sinning.
Yeah. So it mentions him sinning, right? So it says, basically, I'm going to discipline him if he sins. So if we take it straight to Jesus and say this is only about Jesus, then that presents us a little problem. So there's two views. One is to take it only to Jesus. And people who do that typically see the discipline as like Jesus not being punished for his sins, but for the sins of everybody on the cross. The other option, and the option I hold, is this: there's a double fulfillment idea going on in this passage. There's an initial fulfillment with Solomon, who we're going to see in Kings, who built the temple and who did sin big time and who was disciplined. But God still, here's the key, did not reject the house of David as he rejected the house of Saul. Does that make sense? So I see kind of a double fulfillment here, but I would just be honest, there's others who don't see that. But that's where we get. So here's the key to this covenant. This is a covenant again that God is making with David. And this one harkens back to the Abrahamic covenant in what ways? Yes, the land. Yeah. So there's kind of a double aspect here. So the land and then the rest from the enemies. Abraham was promised land, but then what about their enemies? You remember Abraham, in the Abrahamic covenant it says, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you will be cursed. So we might tie that to the safe place in the land. What else? That's right. Both have promises regarding offspring. And this is probably the biggest connector, because if you remember Abrahamic covenant, there's an offspring promised to bless the nations, but we zoom it down through the book of Genesis to the nation of Israel, but in particular the tribe of Judah. And you remember Ruth connected Judah and David, and now we're seeing why. Because here the promise is, we know that the line, the one who's going to crush the serpent's head, is now coming through David. That's exactly right. So there's this unbroken line from David. Now here's the deal. We know, looking back, that this is fulfilled in Jesus, and we also know that that it doesn't really tell us anything about like how it doesn't tell us that this covenant is going to be fulfilled in one king. Right now, all we know is it's an eternal dynasty, right? But when we get into the prophets later in the Old Testament, they make it very clear that there is a single one who's like David, who is coming, who will fulfill the promises of this covenant. And he gives us a lot more detail. So when we get back from break, we're going to talk about the prophets and their portrayal of this king, this royal king to come. Okay? Any other connections with the Abrahamic covenant? He'll make his name great. That is exactly the same thing that God promised Abraham in Genesis 12. Remember, because there's that contrast between Abraham, who God was going to make his name great, and the tower builders who were trying to make a name for themselves. And so that's now continued in David. So you get David and Abraham, both of these big Old Testament covenants, both involve their name being great. Okay? So let me just kind of bring us all together and summarize it. Here's what you need to take away from this. The key promise of the Davidic covenant is an eternal house or throne, however you want to put it. Or a dynasty. You can even use the word dynasty. It doesn't matter, just to be able to recognize it and know what it is. So this is a key takeaway, is that as we go through the biblical story, we know that because this covenant is also tied to the future of Israel's prosperity in the land, that this covenant is the key to seeing God restoring Israel to their fortunes. Okay? Now, here's how this plays out. I just mentioned the prophets. But this just shows you how important this covenant is, and also how it links back to the Abrahamic covenant. The first words of the New Testament are written or in the Gospel of Matthew, which we're going to look at later after we get back. But Matthew begins his book by calling it basically the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and then he uses two terms for Jesus. He calls him the son of David and the son of Abraham. The son of David and the son of Abraham. So what that is showing us, what Matthew is showing in the first sentence of the New Testament, is that this one whose name is Jesus is the Christ, which is Messiah, and he fulfills the Davidic covenant and he fulfills the Abrahamic covenant. And so everything's moving in that direction is what we're even seeing here on this part. Any questions? Okay, now it gets ugly because we're about to see Mr. Hyde come out in David, okay? Quite literally. So here we go. What this next part of David's reign is all about is his failures. And I want to take a moment real quick just to highlight how the biblical story oftentimes does not hide the character's flaws. In fact, I'm about to argue that the author emphasizes David's flaws in 2 Samuel for a reason. And we'll talk about that in just a second. but David's flaws. Now, why is the fact that all these great heroes in the Bible have some major character flaws? Why is that a comfort to you and me?
Because we have them as well.
Thank you. Because we're just like them. We have our mountaintop great days where we think that we do great things for God and His kingdom. And then we have moments where we are just like shaking our head in disgust over how wicked we are and how we can do certain things that we never thought we would ever do. And so the character, the flaws in the biblical story are a testimony of God's grace and the fact that God does work through flawed and sinful people, which should be a great encouragement to us, especially those of us who truly want to serve God and do work for His kingdom, that He's not finished with us and He's not going to throw us in the trash can if we blow it one time, that God can continue to work through us. But like David, we must be people who are willing to repent and get back on. So He gives us great hope. So let's talk about David's flaws. So what happens really after 2 Samuel 10, the rest of the book of Samuel is focused on David in a negative light. I mean, it's negative. And we never talk about this in our churches. We do talk about David and Bathsheba, but we really stop there. Most Christians have no idea about the stories from 2 Samuel like 13 all the way to the end of the book. So let's talk about those briefly today. Okay, so here we go. David's sins. The second half of Samuel, the second half of 2 Samuel is actually bracketed by two major sins of David. Okay, so it's kind of like what you call this in literature an inclusio or bookends. And what it does is it's trying to make those prominent so that we read everything in between in light of those two things. So the book wants us to read everything in between in light of David's sins. So what are those two sins? The first one you know well. Even if you haven't grown in church, David's and Bathsheba is like one of the key sins that we know about in the Bible. So David, out on his roof, right? I don't think I have to repeat this story. Sees a woman bathing. So he lusts after her and invites her to his palace, right? So he breaks the 10th commandment of envy. Then he brings her into his palace. She's a married woman. He still has sexual relations with her, breaking the command not to commit adultery. And then when that happens, she sends word that she's pregnant, and he's like, uh-oh, got to cover this thing up. Like guilty as charged, right? For me, how quickly we are to cover our sins. So he goes to try to cover it up by bringing her husband home from battle. Now, this is the interesting part of the story, and his goal is to get her husband to actually go have sex with her. But what does her husband do? He won't. And why will he not?
He's a righteous man who follows God's law about warfare and sexual relations during warfare.
Yeah. And he says, his statement is basically my fellow Israelites are out there fighting on the battlefield, and I'm not going to come back home and enjoy the pleasures of my wife while they're out there fighting. I mean, talk about honorable. That's honorable. But check out the irony. You see how the roles have been reversed? David is now Saul. Do y'all see this? David has now become the bad guy, and who's the good guy? Uriah. So here it is. David's men are out fighting for him, and he's stealing their wives. And yet one of them comes back, and he won't even go sleep with his own wife. He has every right to sleep with her because his fellow Israelites are out fighting a battle, and they can't enjoy their wife. So he's like, I'm not going to take a pleasure of my wife if they can't. Now talk about honor. But again, here's what we see. The story's been flipped. David's now the bad guy. So David even tries to get the guy drunk. And even drunk, he won't go back and sleep with his wife. So what does David do? He decides he just got to kill him. So put him up there on the front, let the people on the wall shoot him, and he's dead. And so David, he just ratchets through the 10 Commandments. Let's just tear them all up while we're at it, is what David does. So he shows his great failures, okay? Now, this is where we usually stop, and then we go to what psalm? In your churches, what psalm do we go to as soon as we tell this story? Which is good. We should go there. Psalm 51. Ever heard that? So Psalm 51 was written right after this, and it is a great prayer of confession. In fact, if you are burdened by your sin and by their guilt, I would encourage you just to read Psalm 51 as your own prayer to God, because it's a great psalm expressing repentance, but it also ends with restoration, because God's a God who restores people who have fallen into sin. So adultery, but there's where we stop. And what we don't do is read the rest of the book. And the rest of the book, I'll just go ahead and warn you, this is a little rated R, it's messy, it's ugly. Because what happens is really the rest of the book is what we might call the punishment/consequences of David's sins. And let me just read you, so what happens is God sends a prophet to David named Nathan, who tells this parable, really smart way to confront him, pins him against the wall, and here's what he says, 2 Samuel 2:10-12. He says, "Now therefore, The sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and me there is God, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says Yahweh, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. Now, a little crazy here. Here it is. Here are the key components of David's kind of punishment/consequences. The sword will not depart from his house. In other words, his house is going to be full of murder and fighting and all kinds of conflict. Second one, someone is going to commit public adultery with his wives, because he committed adultery with Uriah's wife in private, public adultery. And then it's not in those verses, but later we find out that the child that him and Bathsheba conceived dies. Okay? So let me just walk you through summary fashion the rest of the book to show you how this plays out. Okay? In chapter 13, David has a son named Amnon who falls in love with his half-sister Tamar. You can't make this up. And so he rapes her. Well, Tamar's brother Absalom seeks to avenge his sister's defilement, so he murders Amnon. So you get this? So one of David's sons rapes one of David's daughters. One of David's other sons kills David's son. There's the sword. Okay? Then what happens is Absalom stages basically a takeover and wins the favor of the people and runs his dad, so one of David's sons, runs him out of the palace. And David, again, is in the wilderness on the run. Not this time from Saul, but from his own son named Absalom. Then Absalom takes David's concubines up on the roof of the palace, and he has sexual relations with them in front of all of Israel. And then Absalom chases David into the wilderness, and as he's chasing them there, they basically start having civil war again, and one of David's commanders, who was kind of David's head commander, but David didn't like him often, was Joab. He kills Absalom. It's actually, some of you might be familiar with the story. Absalom had long hair, and what happens, you remember this story, he's riding his donkey, and he gets caught in a tree with his long hair. So then Joab and his men decide to have a spear throwing competition. And they're a little better than Saul was, so they actually hit their target and he dies. Well, what happens is David is just broken. He's mourning because he lost his son. Even though it was the son who betrayed him, he still was mourning and broken. And it was just ugly. It's just 2 Samuel, the second half is just, again, it's kind of like Judges. It shows us the chaos that comes from sin. And this time it's showing us the chaos that comes from David's sin as the king of Israel. It destroys his house. It causes conflict with the people. Okay? Now, the other sin that's mentioned at the end of the book is in 2 Samuel 24, there's a record of an unlawful census. So this is the other sin that brackets the second half of 2 Samuel. Now, we don't, the text does not tell us exactly why it was unlawful, but from other biblical texts, many scholars would assume that it was unlawful because David was counting his mighty men as an act of not trusting in Yahweh to fight for Israel. Does that make sense? So it's more to do with the motives than the actual census, is what many scholars would say. So as a result, God actually gives David a choice of 3 punishments. He says, I'll give you 7 years of famine, I'll give you 3 months of defeat by your enemies, or a 3-day plague. And David actually chooses the 3-day plague because he says, I would rather fall in the hands of God than the hands of my enemies, which tells us a lot about David's view of God. So there was a plague that comes through, and David actually stops the plague by building an altar and giving a sacrifice, offering offerings on this threshing floor that actually becomes the site of the temple later. So that's how that story ends. Okay, so here's the question we want to ask, and we have 4 minutes. Why so much focus on David's sins? The author didn't have to do that. He could have ended the book with talking about David's positive attributes, but he, in the second half of the book, is just all about David's sins. Why? There you go. I think, yeah, that's exactly right. And let me show you from David's own words, okay? So you remember I told you that the book of Samuel has 2 poems that carry the same themes, and we looked at Hannah's song? Well, David has another one in 2 Samuel 24 that echoes Hannah's song. But then he has this poem. In 2 Samuel 23, here are what are called David's last words. Now, I've got the ESV up here, but I'm going to read the New King James because I think the interpretation is a little better. Here's what 2 Samuel 23:5 says. Although my house is not so with God, yet he is made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. Now, I really just realized I forgot to read this part. So let's read this part first. Sorry. Let's start over. Take 2. All right. When one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass sprout from the earth. Okay, so what David is saying is when you have a just and good ruler, ruling in the fear of God, it feels like this. And what do those metaphors bring out? Like the sun on a cloud this morning, like rain on that makes the grass grow. Feels like spring, doesn't it? And what do we all love about spring? We love spring. Why? Because winter's over. Life's coming back. So it's life-giving, right? When a king rules in justice and honor. Well, here's what David says. Although my house is not so with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For this is all my salvation, all my desire. Will he not make it increase? See what David is saying at the end of the book? He's saying all the stuff we just read, it brought a lot of pain and agony on the people of Israel. And he gets that. The people of Israel aren't feeling like a spring morning after David's plague. Okay? But the point is, what David is saying is even though his house isn't there, what is his hope in? David's hope is in the everlasting covenant that we just read about. And so what he's doing for us as readers is telling us where we should put our hope. Our hope isn't in David. It's in this everlasting covenant. There's another one coming. And this is actually going to prepare us for the book of Kings, because I'm going to give you a little preview. In the book of Kings, we think, oh, is this the one? And then we get our hopes dashed because they all fall short. And it keeps us looking to the future for that serpent crusher. So why David sins? To highlight he's not the one, but to highlight the need for hope in the Davidic covenant, which is the hope of the entire Bible as we keep moving.